I've been collecting advertisements selling generative AI to desperate students. What are the characteristics of these advertisements? Well, firstly, they recognise that the students are desperate. They haven't completed any reading in the course. They haven't attended any classes. They have not commenced their assignment the night before it's due, even though they were given a syllabus at the start of the semester. And there's also this interesting awareness that our universities have the hardware, the software and the wetware to diagnose the students are using generative AI. But for less than £5, these particular services will serve the student, save the student and ensure they get an A without being detected. Now, these advertisements are interesting because they validate shortcuts, they validate excuses, and they're anti and indeed post information literacy and academic literacies. And their entire business model is based on a student being in deficit, desperate, not knowing what's going on, and most precisely not able to confront the issue that they haven't done the reading and they're confusing learning and cheating. So in response to these online advertisements, what's happening in our universities? Well, of course, most of our universities have a person, a leader, with or without the inverted commas, explaining to us all that we need to drink the Kool-Aid, we need to get on the generative AI bus, and we need to use it in our assessment. That is the future. And if we don't, we'll be left behind. Disruption, once more, is supposedly good for us. Now, for those of you who are the same age as me and therefore close to death, we've heard this techno enthusiasm over and over again for WebCT, for Blackboard, for Wikipedia, for Google, for much of the last 25 years of online learning. With our underfunding of our neoliberal institutions, it's much easier to celebrate this techno-shaman than to ask the difficult questions about teaching and learning. And these difficult questions include: how do we care for our students and our academics in their diversity? How do we place learning at the centre of our work? And how do we displace that very inelegant binary opposition of learning versus cheating? So today I'm not going to offer these sort of easy answers to very difficult questions. Today I'm not going to confuse learning and cheating. I'm not going to confuse the important and the new. Instead, what I hope for us is we build up a new concept: porous learning. We've got 4 sections to explore that concept today, and let's start with the first, the bias of communication. And I want to start with a major and important scholar, an incredibly important scholar in the history of ideas, Professor Harold Innis. Now, Innis's goal was to discover how the medium of communication transforms what we see, what we understand, and what we interpret. So Harold Innis was born in 1894 and he died in 1952. And if you think about those span of years, he commenced his life through newspaper culture and he concluded his life through televisual culture. And he was interested in the development of national communication systems and how those national communication systems could move internationally. Now, Harold Innis was a truly famous academic who did investigate early in his career pretty dull ideas. For example, his PhD was written on the Canadian railway system, and he also wrote books on the cod fisheries and the fur trade. Pretty exciting. But what's so remarkable is at the point that many of us as scholars would be satiated in our achievements, he moved from economics and political history through to communication science. At its most basic, He was interested in investigating the relationship between the medium of communication and the construction of identity. Suddenly, this man became interested in really big concepts: time, space, identity. And he became focused on the notion of bias. So when most of us think about bias, we think about politicians, we think about journalists with a pretty skewed rendering of the world. But Innes argued that society has been dominated through our times, through our decades, by particular modes of communication. So clay, papyrus, parchment, paper. And each medium of communication configures a different monopoly of knowledge. A society that is able to balance time and space-oriented media is successful in both space and time. But if the bias is not recognised, then communication media configure the limits, the frame, the parameter of what is possible to express. So bias is used a little bit differently in Innes's work compared to our current usage. Think of it as a bias cut dress or a bias cut top. What that means is the fabric of the frock is cut into a particular direction, so it goes into one area and not another. So when Harold Innes uses the word bias, he argues that the communication system is being organised in a particular way that encourages particular types of thinking, but also then discards others. Innes, when he was using bias, meant emphasis. So Innes studied the Greek and the Roman empires in particular. The Roman Empire, of course, was based on written communication, passing Roman law throughout the empire. But oral communication is different. It embeds knowledge into community members, and those community members carry through the oral tradition ideas through time. This was used by the Greek Empire, of course, and it was called the oral tradition and the epic technique. Whether a society has a bias for space or time, geography or history, is enabled through the medium of communication. So what makes Innes so incredibly important, I think, is this sensory element. He asks, what do we lose from our world when all communication systems are aligned for the visual, for the eye? So Innes's bias of communication is not only a theory of culture, a theory of power, a theory of identity, it's also a theory of technology. So space-biased media prioritizes the eye, prioritizes the individual, and time-based media prioritizes the ear, the group, the community. Our universities now value and validate space-biased communication. We are a long way from the Socratic model. So whenever we make a decision in teaching and learning to prioritise the visual, that is a bias of communication, and it's encouraging particular ways of learning, but also then discarding others. For those of us living well after Innes's death, every new communication and media platform is increasing this bias of space. Ideas, people, and money have moved more and more and more over space at faster speeds, Virilio 101. So space has been commodified. The question, therefore, is what we have all lost through this heavy dominance of space-biased media. The screen is not the world. It is a bias of communication, and it flattens. It shrinks our understanding of not only the world, but a world view. Therefore, even though Innes died before the arrival of the internet, let's update this story. Let's explore what's happening as this space bias of communication has been extended. Let's move to our second stop. Let's look at multimodality. How do we decide as teachers what platform we are going to use in our learning processes. How do we manage this bias of communication that exists not only in our institutions, but in our personal and professional histories? How do we activate our learning expertise? How do we activate assessment design that's so often automated within learning management systems? Today, I ask that we all return that reflection to the formulation of the relationship between knowledge, platform, and audience, rather than allow those learning management systems to make decisions for us. So when do we decide I'm going to post a photograph on Instagram? I'm going to record a podcast. I'm going to record a video. How do we make these types of decisions? How do we make a decision that, you know what, I'm going to hold a meeting or do something really clever? I don't need to hold a meeting. I can send that email. So the answer to all these questions, and indeed the answer to some of the most important questions of our time about learning, teaching, but also about citizenship, is multimodality. But to get to this discussion, we had to first explore that bias of communication and how empowered institutions like our universities have made decisions about educational media. Multimodality is part of media literacy, and if I can present that visually for you, information is an enormous circle, information literacy is within it, media literacy is within information literacy, and multimodality is at the core of our conversation. So what we're dealing with now is multimodality. Well, let's do the word. Multi meaning many. Mode meaning platform, and ality meaning that which is of the word. So physicality, multimodality, corporeality. So the word refers to the many platforms and the many channels that are now the nature of our reality, our way of experiencing information, knowledge, and life. It also recognises the ease with which digital material can now move over space and over national boundaries. But this technological determinism is truncating our andragogical decision making about the alignment of form and content, media, and our learning materials. There are powerful consequences if we are not activating multimodal conversations in our universities. And we need to explore how we are building an information scaffold, starting where we are comfortable, where we know what is going on, but then moves us one step at a time to more complex ideas, to more complicated ways of learning. Put another way, we are moving from everyday to applied to theoretical and reflexive literacy. So what we're doing is we're taking one mode of knowledge on a particular platform and our expertise on that particular mode and moving us through more complicated literacy conversations. So we're able to deploy our strengths, understand our weaknesses, and improve not only our learning, but our understanding of how we learn. Multimodality allows us all to make informed choices about which platform will most effectively engage a particular cohort or group of learners. Modality, without the multi, modality confirms how particular signifying practices in a textual system determine the limits of the real, the true, the appropriate, and the believed. Multimodality recognises that there are multiple realities, multiple truths, multiple ways of thinking and learning. And if we mismatch information, platform, and learner, then communication will not work and learning will not work. So therefore, we need to understand how a reality, a worldview, is constructed in a text. And that worldview has to be recognised by learners. Learners must be literate within it. And if the modality is not recognised, then we haven't done the work to build an information scaffold, and then our understanding of life and learning will not occur. Multimodality, therefore, summons a consciousness for us all about the multiple realities that are available to be accessed through different learning and teaching platforms. Multimodality proves that the medium is not the message. Modality is not determined by the form, the signifier, the medium, but our interpretation of the form, that is, the signified. Every signifier, media, every signifier has multiple signifieds, content. Our reality, what we believe, is based on the interpretation of signifiers. So that means we all trust some textual systems and not others. And each of us have cues that we read as reliable or credible or truthful. Modality cues, though, are based on our experience of the world and our experience and literacy in that particular medium. But this type of information really helps us make decisions about working out which particular platforms we use in teaching and learning. It means we finally stop all those assumptions about gender and race and sexuality and age, and we look at actual evidence, who is using particular platforms at a specific time. We always ask, what is the most effective platform to convey this learning information to this group? Now, the late Gunther Kress was the fine and most important scholar of multimodality. Now, it is important that we remember his academic history. He built social semiotics with Bob Hodge in the 1980s, and we're going to return to that phrase social semiotic in a second. But through the 1990s, he became interested in visual communication, how images work. But through the 2000s, before his death, multimodality became his focus. How do we determine the best use of a media platform to convey specific shards of information? When should we use images? When should we use sound? When should we use text? As you can see, multimodality really matters now because of globalization, because it's so easy to move digital material through space and time. But just because something can move digitally doesn't mean that it should. It doesn't also mean that it's the best way to present that information, or that the people who receive it have the literacies to decode and interpret it. And this is the key argument we're going to deploy to enliven our porous learning model today. Let's remember the Gunther Kress rule. The greater the cultural difference, the greater the differences in terms of representational systems and literacies. Therefore, university teachers, post our widening participation agenda of some 25 years now, means that we can't assume that our interpretation of information, our information literacy, our media literacy is shared with others. What works in our universities may not work outside of our universities, and indeed what works in our universities probably doesn't work in our universities. So therefore, let's summon our third section of the day. Let's look at what is going wrong in our universities and how perhaps we can correct it. Let's look at the deficit model of teaching and learning. Right, let's start with some definitional work. This model of learning starts with the ideology that women, men, non-binary identifying citizens are incomplete. They're lacking. They come to an educational infrastructure lacking in their expertise, and they require a teacher, they require a master to make them whole, to bring them to knowledge. This deficit model particularly impacts and is actioned on the students who differ from the supposedly normal student. And of course, those students that differ from the norm must be corrected for their deficiencies. The deficit model of teaching and learning in higher education was particularly focused on first-year undergraduate students, recognising the dropout rates, recognising the profound dissatisfaction of first years. But instead of assuming that the students needed to change, understanding the deficit model of teaching and learning, renewed the focus on what is occurring, what are the assumptions in our institutions. So this is a whole of institution transformation, working through information literacy, even transforming our understandings of employability. Now, the attrition rate in doctoral programs remains the great secret of those programs. And think about it, how do we socialise students into our doctoral program? We have inductions, we have orientations, we have all these professional development courses, but the trouble we have is PhD supervision is individualised. An array of strategies attempt to regulate the supervisory-student relationship, so it might be a supervisory charter or supervisory training, but how often do we hear the data point of one? When I did my PhD, like that is a generalisable data set. But as we know, a lot is going wrong in doctoral programs. The recent studies on mental health in PhD programs in particular, that's a proxy that there are some structural problems going on. So let's discuss what's going wrong from the first year of an undergraduate program right the way through to our PhD programs. So the deficit suggests that something is wrong with the student and that there is a normal way of doing an undergraduate program, there's a normal way of doing a coursework master's, there's a normal way of doing a PhD. And the trouble is those who haven't had, which is most of us, those who haven't had a life experience aligned with what's seen to be the normal pathway into and out of a university are marked as different, as in deficit, and require remedial training and pathway programs. We have a greater diversity of students now in our universities than at any point in our histories. But we need a better way beyond what Biggs has described as, quote, blame the student. Sometimes, perhaps most of the time, the reasons for the failure, the reason for the attrition is not poor motivation. It's not a lack of ability. Remember where we started this presentation today, the bias of communication. Our platforms are chosen, our platforms are constructed to enable empowered ideas to move through space and time. The consequences of this model is we use language about students and the knowledge that they bring into the program, and we discard it. So we use unproductive, counterproductive, problematic and irrelevant to understand what students bring into our universities. Now, this is a disaster for many reasons. Firstly, when we discard student knowledge, we actually block their capacity to learn. I've always had a teaching rule through my 30-year career, and that is start where students are rather than where I want them to be. For those of us who are living in colonised nations, if we ignore or marginalise Indigenous, First Nation or First Peoples knowledges, then we are continuing the colonisation of those citizens. The best of learning is able to take a student's experience, expertise and knowledge and discover the andragogical strategies that are necessary to align disciplinary knowledge with that prior experience. In other words, what we're enabling is the social semiotic, aligning social systems with textual systems, remembering, of course, Hodge and Kress here. Now, we've forgotten the tropes and knowledges around the social semiotic. And the reason we've forgotten this is because it's simpler, it's cheaper, and it's easier to buy software, to buy a learning management system and squeeze students and squeeze academics into that LMS. Secondly, of course, the ignorance and marginalisation of student knowledge particularly is disastrous for those groups who manage discrimination in the rest of their lives. These assumptions of learning, These assumptions about doctoral supervision can result in heteronormative, procreative, colonial, white, English-speaking, ageist, ableist, misogynist, you get the picture. And those ideologies not only squeeze out alternative views, they squeeze out the bulk of the population. Think about, for example, how much of doctoral education is highly normative. Think about the assumptions we have of students. Put into Google Images a search for PhD students, and what pops up? Well, hello, very young men and young women in a lab-based environment. There's one of those images. You can probably pick the supervisor there. But such assumptions not only hurt individual students, they actually hurt our entire doctoral program. Barbara Lovett, in her book Leaving the Ivory Tower, showed that 50% of students that start a PhD program do not finish it. Yet every thesis, every student that leaves the program is supposedly an individual failure. So Lovett's described this as the, quote, invisible problem, and that is the high attrition rate of students in our programs. But this invisible problem is caused by the deficit model of teaching and learning in our doctoral programs. And significantly, hang on to yourself, the attrition rate in doctoral programs for women and students of colour is higher than that of white men. Okay, so let's invert this issue for one moment. Who is actually finishing in our doctoral program? Well, the science-based disciplines have a higher completion rate than the humanities, arts and social sciences, and the men in the sciences in the structured lab environments have the fastest completions. Now, the University of Melbourne listed the characteristics of the students that attrit. Why do students leave the program? And you'll notice none of those characteristics are remotely engaged with the intelligence of the student. None of the reasons students leave are about intellectual ability. Research shows that the completers and the non-completers are equally academically able. So why are they leaving? That's the key. And the solution you see that most universities implement when they have data sets like this is we assume that the attrition is caused because we selected the wrong students in the first place. So if we can just get that initial selection right, then the attrition problem will go away. Now, of course, that is absolutely and completely wrong. As selection has got more and more prescriptive, the attrition, the leaving rate has actually increased because the institutional teaching and learning and supervising protocols have not altered. The literature about the deficit model of teaching and learning is clear, and I particularly acknowledge the remarkable research from Janice Lombardi commencing in 2016. And she focused on the role of teacher expectations, and she showed that teacher expectations are actually more important than student motivation. So if teachers have low expectations of particular students on the basis of age or race or sexuality or gender, some sort of xenophobia, then those students are less likely to graduate. So what I'm particularly interested in, therefore, is not the deficit model for individual students, but how we have institutionalized the deficit model through our universities. In universities, we are complicit in this deficit model. Think about the language we deploy when students are having some trouble: remedial, at risk, culturally deprived, disadvantaged. Now, Lombardi offered 5 clear strategies to manage this deficit model. So we have solutions in the literature, and most of them are very easy to implement. But therefore, why has this deficit model been perpetuated? And the answer is because it's a lot easier to put the blame on an individual student than look at the role of the institution in collective failure. So the university is never to blame. The individual student just simply didn't work hard enough, and we're blaming a lot of individual students over many generations, rather than we as an institution, rather than we as an international higher education sector assessing the impact of our definitions of deficit teaching and learning on our very understanding of achievement, of assessment, of learning design. You see, generative AI is merely our next instalment in this. Because we haven't validated multimodality and the abundance model of teaching and learning, students don't attend class, they don't read, and then they panic around assessments, and they logically, therefore, take a shortcut. And this all happens because they have not had the experience overtly and clearly of the role of information literacy and academic literacy programs scaffolding them to success. And of course, what happens is the students then go on to blame themselves. They're not good enough and they attrit. So once more, that binary of learning and cheating is lying to us. All these characteristics from students are proxies. They're proxies that a deficit model of teaching and learning is in place. So how do we therefore create this socially, culturally, intellectually diverse space in higher education? The key first step is to critique the notion of the academic, the teacher, as God, as Yoda, as the keeper of all knowledge. And the problem, you see, is that our academic promotion structures require us to see ourselves as this great leader, this individual, this Yoda, this keeper of all knowledge. And we have to talk about how great we are as teachers. I'm a great teacher. Oh, I'm such a great teacher. You won't be promoted. You won't get a job without that. So our institutional structures require us to individualize teaching rather than explore the collective nature of learning. So we need to remember, following on from Biggs, that learning is a way of interacting with the world. Not the way a teacher interacts with the world, but the way we all interact with the world. Therefore, academics, to help our students learn, have to understand our students first. We have to understand our students' worlds first, and then we can connect disciplinary expertise and disciplinary standards with what's required to graduate from a program. Standards are important. You will never hear me discredit the importance of standards, but we do not require standardization to reach those standards. So think about the impact of removing this deficit model of teaching and learning, because suddenly we can recognise what students are bringing to knowledge. If we can be more porous in our understandings of learning and teaching and research, then knowledge itself will be transformed. It is time to understand the consequences of that institutional bias of communication. Now, we became academics. We became teachers because we were successful students. We were able to return to our teachers the assessments that they understood, that they liked, that they were literate in. So we were able to return to our teachers a model of communication in which they had also been successful. So we gained from that homology, while tens of thousands of other students did not. Therefore, let's finish off our gig for the day with our final stop, and let's look at Porous Learning and the Universal Design University. Porous learning and teaching is founded on three maxims, three principles. We're building the relationship between the social semiotic, multimodality, and universal design. All textual systems, academic or otherwise, exist in a social system. And at the moment, our social system is neoliberalism. And this social system emphasises the individual, choice, markets, anti-regulation, post-governance, freedom of speech, rather than freedom to read. But when we value and validate the diversity of our students, when we validate the diversity of teaching and learning histories before neoliberalism, then we can construct a different future. Our job is to connect our students' life, their knowledge, their current information literacy with the standards that are required to graduate from a degree. When we, with transparency, using an information scaffold, are able to move students from everyday to applied to theoretical to reflexive literacy. And we enact that process when we enable multimodality and universal design. No deficit, just an opportunity to render our universities more socially just. There are lots of descriptors we can use of this new model of teaching and learning. One of the most evocative, I think, is the abundance model of teaching and learning. And I particularly acknowledge the wonderful Rebecca Alber's work here. And there are clear characteristics of the abundance model, and they make enormous sense for those of us that work in higher education institutions when we're trying to understand the barriers that block student success. Too often we teach as we were taught, and yet our universities, let alone the political economy that frames them, have transformed enormously in the last 5 years, let alone the last 30. Too often, subjectivity, experience, a data set of one, when I did my degree, becomes more important than the really strong SOTL and SOS scholarship that exists in the world. So we apply this subjectivity, and this is, of course, a pre-existing bias. And that's what Harry and Klinger described as the socio-cultural deficit lens, end of quote. Now, the challenge we have is that the leadership in our universities remains dominated by white men, most of whom are trained in the hard sciences. Therefore, at its most basic, role modelling of the diversity of our students and academics is difficult because most of us are not white men trained in the experimental sciences. Therefore, how can we shift from the university to the multiversity? Well, we have to return to the role of multimodality in enabling a critique of the bias of communication, our respect for the social semiotic, the social environment around learning, and the construction of curricula and assessment design that is porous and commences with respect and compassion. Now, an array of research confirms that the students that reflect on the completion of their assignments, the completion of their degrees, are more likely to complete that assignment and complete their degrees. Therefore, when we configure assessments with that meta-reflection in place, where students are reflecting on the very nature of learning design, the nature of knowledge development, it's not only a great way to sidestep generative AI, but it also allows us to connect up for our students their movement from basic and everyday literacies to applied to theoretical to reflexive. So multimodality is crucial here. It allows us to critique the deficit model by focusing on the learning of students rather than the neoliberal management of teachers. How do we learn about learning? Such a question reminds us, I think, about the privilege of being a university teacher and the privileges of teaching and research I never take for granted. But the problem is that the gifts of higher education to individuals, to families, to regions, to nations, to the world, these gifts are rarely discussed. You see, at the moment, universities are a problem, and the academic workforce is quite a challenging workforce. But instead of the intricate and tough conversations that you're all going to have today at Salford, we need to really focus on what's going wrong and how we are going to fix it. Too often these conversations are displaced. And they're displaced because we have a group of experts, with or without the inverted commas, and these experts are often called, unbelievably, educational consultants. And these educational consultants are brought into our universities to explain what we're doing wrong, and they're paid a fee to show the alternatives that are available. And those alternatives do not validate the diversity of students, the public good, information literacies, or enhancing and lifting the rates of reading and writing and quality assurance. No. Instead, a Fordist model of teaching and learning is returned. We're back to Stanley Arnowitz's The Knowledge Factory, and we are serving the interests of industry, narrowly defined. Now, an example, a horrific example of this truly appalling genre comes from Martin Betts and Michael Rosman's The New Learning Economy, written in 2023. And they propose once more it's time for a new university again. And this new university needs to learn the entrepreneurial lessons of Tesla, Spotify, YouTube, and Apple, with, hang on to yourself, Elon Musk being the model of leadership we require in our universities. Now, considering the populism and the mess that Musk has created in Twitter, X, I don't think that's a viable option. Do you? Doubling down on neoliberalism, increasing the exploitation of academic staff and professional staff, and medicating the dissatisfaction of students by reducing standards, reducing the reading that's required, reducing the length of assignments, is enabling generative AI to be the simple and obvious option for them. And if we enact this project, it will end international higher education. Instead, let's provide a little bit more than digital access to information. That's not sufficient to produce a multimodal curriculum. Now, many students still think, and they act as if access to Google, access to generative AI is enough to tackle any problem that they may encounter. It is crucial that we, therefore, from the very first week of a higher education experience, that we value libraries, that we value librarians, we value information and academic literacies. Universal design matters enormously to this conversation, to intervene and to make change. Now, initially, universal design was based on housing accessibility, and these design choices resulted in services and products that are not only useful for citizens with impairments, but useful for all. And by designing curricula with universal design principles as the first lens, it suddenly becomes accessible for all, and the focus shifts from the content to be taught to the learner to be taught. Indeed, Justin Powell described this movement as the, quote, universal design university. This is a foundational commitment, beginning with open and accessible learning architecture. The word enabling is so important to this discussion today because it signifies a location, it signifies a recognition of the disabling structures that exist in our lives, rather than focusing on disabled people. Discrimination creates disability through learning. Universal design enables all scholars to learn, and learn with access to and engagement with multimodal learning platforms. This is the building block of the multiversity, commencing with andragogical, metaphoric curb cuts. The impact of not respecting differences and implementing these simple andragogical curb cuts is clear, but remains typical of many of our universities. This marginalisation through analogue space is only intensified through the institutional push to digitisation. We all remember the pandemic, what colleagues and I described as panic learning. Shortcuts and speed were valued over learning design and backward mapping. We are still living with the consequences of that panic learning and the truncation of andragogical decision making. And can I say, we're starting to see the consequences in doctoral programs. Universal design is not a short-term strategy for economic efficiency. It is a long-term movement to transform learning and teaching, but also the relationship between teaching and research in higher education. When we enact this multiversity, there are three stages. Firstly, we have to remove analogue and digital barriers to participation. Then we activate these principles of learning design. And we finish with the promotion and the validation of diverse options and pathways through a degree and through every single assessment. All interventions must commence with accessibility, and that's accessibility to classrooms, to toilets, to learning management systems. And if that first stage is not reached, then all other interventions are irrelevant. Access is the first step, but attrition results if it's the only step. Universal design, therefore, activates a deep and necessary reconciliation between the exclusionary historical legacies in higher education and the present capacities for injustice and discrimination emerging through neoliberalism. The gift of commencing our work in teaching and learning with universal design, multimodality, and the trope of the multiversity is that we see our curriculum, we see our assessment, we see our classrooms, our daily communication exchanges in a completely different way. New relationships emerge between form and function, platform and knowledge, text and context. And this project summons learning-led teaching and learning-led research. We look for relationships, alignments, movements. Knowledge is porous. Learning architecture is porous. The relationship between teachers and learners, that relationship is porous. We respect the gifts, the diversity of knowledge systems, and they change us, and they change how we see the world. The brittleness of those ChatGPT ads with the shortcuts and the truncation of the relationship between learning and cheating can now be recognised for what they are. They are neoliberal solutions to neoliberal problems. Learning is challenging, learning is uncomfortable, and pushing the boundaries of a learner's expectations certainly can result in discomfort. At worst, these learning experiences can be discriminatory, blocking educational events and processes. But this demeaning of difference may not be intentional on behalf of the teacher. But when we as teachers continue to teach as we were taught without educational theory, educational qualifications, professional development, providing those nodes of reflection and critique, then legacy architecture, including intellectual architecture, can proliferate. The remarkable Paul Gonski described this process as, quote, recycling misperceptions, all of which justify inequalities, end of quote. Therefore, interventions through universal design can freshen our thinking, interrupt our legacy intellectual infrastructure, and they also happen to shred neoliberal ideologies. This last decade that we've all shared has been punctuated by short-termism, poor decision-making, and an overvaluing of personal experience, our feelings, rather than learning from the research and enabling policy on the basis of expertise. For those of us who are still working in our universities, look, we can throw up our hands, we can complain about the world, and I understand that. But instead, and colleagues, together, let's welcome high standards for curricular design and assessment design. Let's build and continue the strong relationships between research and teaching. And let's ensure not only access to education from diverse groups, but ensure success and achievement for these diverse learners. You see, education always matters. It is transformative for individuals, it's transformative for our society, it's transformative of our world. And when we commit to improving learning, we also commit to improving our way of living. Thank you for your time.